Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jack Moore. I'm the news editor here at Nextgov. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Tech Exec Viewcast, How Government is Embracing Innovation. Events like these wouldn't be possible without the support of our underwriters, so I'd like to take a moment to recognize the exclusive underwriters of today's Viewcast, Intel and Amazon Web Services. A bit later, Government Executive Media Group President Constance Sayers-Witherspoon will sit down with Intel's Steve Oren to continue the conversation. In just a few minutes, I will turn to you, our viewers, for your questions. Please submit your questions at any time by tweeting at us during the discussion using the hashtag TechExecViewcast. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Roopangi Kadakia is the Web Services Executive for NASA. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jack.
So first things first, NASA is a pretty big agency and with a pretty illustrious history of innovation. And I was hoping you could start us off by talking about innovation at NASA from your corner of the agency.
Sure. So every center that we have, from JPL to Ames Research Center to Marshall, they're all doing amazing, innovative work. From a web perspective and an application perspective, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we can get to a place where our folks can work from anywhere, anytime, using any type of device. So how do we do that? So that's one set of audiences that we're trying to find innovative solutions for. Another set of audience is really our public audience and our partners external to NASA. And so we want to make sure they get the best, the richest experience of what NASA does. So we want to make sure that we're building technologies and services that can really help them see what NASA does in its best foot forward. How we do that is we look at technology, because technology changes almost on a weekly basis. But we need to make sure that we have really good strategic processes in place so that we can keep up with the newest technology by using agile development practices, making sure that our applications are developed in a way that we can keep the data and expose that data to as many people as possible so they can also come up with some innovative ways of using it.
And on the top of cloud computing, which is a pretty big deal at federal agencies these days, there was some news this week regarding NASA's West Prime cloud migration contract vehicle, and I want to get to that in a second. But first, more broadly, cloud has really made the transition from just being a buzzword to really being implemented by agencies. And I was hoping you could kind of start us off, talking about the evolution at NASA.
Sure.
and where we are today.
Sure. So NASA a few years ago started with a cloud initiative called Nebula. And this was a private cloud offering, really looking at how to use open technologies to create what some of the big optimization efficiencies are in the cloud. And in the last few years, what they found was, this is a service that is fabulous, but the commercial entities have really kept up much faster. They can really keep the innovation going a lot more than an agency can. And there was no real business case to have a private deployment of Nebula, but there was a lot of lessons learned. A lot of the requirements, a lot of the really good practices on how to make security basically intuitive within the cloud offerings, making sure that the open standards were used all the way through the entire life cycle of anything that you were developing were some of the great things that NASA learned. So as that program started to be decommissioned, we took a lot of those lessons learned and made sure they became part of our requirements for West Prime and for our cloud services strategy across NASA.
Now, you mentioned West Prime. So in the early days at a lot of agencies, when they were transitioning and thinking about migrating services to the cloud, there was kind of a headlong rush to do so, and maybe in the absence of a really strategic focus. West Prime is kind of a remedy to that at NASA. Could you talk a little bit about what West Prime is and how it really kind of sets a focus for these migrations?
Sure. So what we did was we interviewed, discussed with over 200 stakeholders across NASA on what would be some of the services that they would like to see. We didn't even say cloud in the beginning. What we really talked about was what do you need for the Office of the Chief Information Officer to provide you that would really give you a good balance between that autonomy that you require and the governments that we require. Where is that fine line? And what we found was that there were certain things that were basically common across all of these stakeholders. And the stakeholders I'm talking about are senior management at NASA to the specific IT developers at the centers and everyone in between, including some of the mission program managers. And what we found is they all wanted to reduce their IT costs. They wanted to make sure that they didn't have to do the security pieces. They wanted to make sure that they didn't have to do a lot of the system administration. But they wanted to have that full autonomy to be the experts in what they were developing. And that was critical because at the end of the day, NASA is very diverse in what we do as an organization. You know, the expertise in climate is very different than the expertise in being a subject matter expert in planetary science. So what we wanted to make sure is we left that autonomy to them, and we created a set of requirements that were really consistent across what we think a cloud environment should look like. And that's what became the requirements for West Prime.
And just this week, your cloud broker InfoZen announced that the first phase of the migration was complete, and that was something like 110 applications, migrated. And, kind of put that in perspective, how many, total applications, public-facing websites, intranets are there at NASA, and what is the full scope, what do the future phases of West Prime look like?
Sure. So 110 sounds like a lot, but if you look at the whole gamut of websites, publicly facing, and potential web applications that are internal or extranets, as you call them, and actual applications that could take advantage of cloud offerings is in the thousands. We have over 1,500 public-facing websites for the public of some sort or the other. Some of them are very specific audience-based. And then we also have approximately 2,000 or so applications and extranets and intranets that are specific to audiences across NASA. So the potential of where we can go is pretty large. The issue really is can we find a way to bring these applications, do the right evaluation, bring these applications into the cloud. If we mandated all these applications come into the cloud, it may not be the best strategy, because what we found was that each application has to be looked at from where it is in its life cycle. That's the only way that you'll be able to find whether or not this is cost effective and whether or not it's the right time for that application to be considered for the cloud.
And I was hoping maybe you could kind of contextualize when you say, 1,500 public-facing websites. That seems like, a lot. So maybe explain what a few of those are,
sure.
And also maybe talk about how the cloud migration really allows NASA to think about consolidating some of those websites.
Sure. So 3 of the ones that we actually host that I am very proud of, even though I have nothing to do with the content, there's some amazing content managers across NASA who take care of these websites. One of them is, of course, nasa.gov. It's our premier flagship website. It's also built completely on an open standard, open source platform. And if you ever have been there, there's a lot of very, very technically enhanced capabilities, like 24/7 NASA TV is on there. We have some great imagery. The other one is science.nasa.gov, which is really focused on some of the science disciplines that we study across NASA. Another one that I'm really, I think is a very nice little website is called Space Station Live, which actually takes information from the space station and is put into the website almost on a live feed. There's information that's redacted, but it makes you feel like you're part of the mission control crowd. It's a great website. It has It has data that you would never be able to really see outside of this type of website. Everything from what research the astronauts are doing, and if they're ever doing any kind of extravehicular activities, what's going on.
And that would be when they're exiting the space station and
yes.
doing, you know,
yes.
repair work, or what,
right.
you know, doing kind of when they're actually leaving the space station.
Right,
yeah.
right, right.
And I think, you know, one of the value propositions for cloud in regard to NASA's websites, I think if you were to list the federal websites that get some of the most traffic, NASA's would certainly be near the top of the list.
Absolutely. We come up consistently as one of the top 500 websites across, you know, in any industry. I think the weather folks, NOAA, probably gets more hits because NWS, I think, because everybody wants the weather also. But we're consistently up there. We have a lot of great missions that people, especially school kids, are always doing research on. So absolutely.
And, you know, this may expand, you know, broader than just West Prime, but maybe talk about how an enterprise-wide approach like that can really help plot a more strategic,
sure.
you know, direction that you're moving in, instead of having, you know, bureaus and sub-agencies, you know, kind of doing their own thing.
Sure. So what we've done is we have what's called a computing services framework. So we're looking at it from a cloud data center. So it's a consolidated a policy or process that we're looking at. And, you know, West Prime is a very, very key to our success, but it's not the only, it's not a one-size-fits-all. We're really focused on productionized types of applications and websites, things that really need to be in production all the time. So a website, you really don't want to take it down at 5 o'clock. But there may be things like if you're doing analysis of big data, you don't need to have a full-time 24/7 type of environment that's fully managed. So we are coming up with what we're calling cloud services environment. So each environment would have its own use case. So web services is a one use case. We may have big data analysis or analytics as another use case. And so that's how we're coming up with a NASA-wide policy. So West Prime really helps us come up with how do we focus on the right security, the right standards, the most cost-efficient way of deploying these applications in the cloud from a productionized application or website perspective.
Mm. And security would seem to be one of the big benefits, to take that out of the hands of you know, the individual bureaus or you know, organizations, and maybe talk about something you mentioned before, this kind of push-pull between autonomy and governance.
Sure.
And how, you know, how that can really, that really drives the effort.
Sure. So, you know, as a government agency, we have a lot of different regulations, policies, and laws that we have to abide by, and good practices that we should be abiding by. So FedRAMP, FSMA, just good practices of good security controls. However, when you're the developer of a website, science.nasa.gov, you want to really, your focus is really on, can I present this information so it's the most value to my audience? And so what we've said is, let us find that balance between autonomy and governance. If you let us take care of that security piece, we'll make sure that you are protected at the level that you need to be, and then you can focus on being that best designer of that information for that audience. For an application, for example, there may be some very interesting and innovative technologies that people might want to put into their application for whatever they're doing. And what our job is to make sure, first of all, that they're using standardized ways of doing it. So they're not opening up all the ports or using versions of applications or technical components that are out of support or have security holes in them. But we let them really develop the application.
And, you know, this would have been about a year ago, the Inspector General really gave West Prime a seal of approval, as it were. But as you mentioned, that's one thing, and then, you know, mandating that people use this contract vehicle, you know, is different in terms of how do you get buy-in, especially with an organization like NASA that's so diffused, spread across the country, with, you know, very different missions at at each different piece of it. How do you go about getting the buy-in from the people on the ground?
Sure. So, one of the great things that it was great to have that particular IG report saying that this is a good contract, you got all the requirements correct. The real interesting thing is our CIOs, both the previous CIO and the current CIO, they made a conscious decision, and I think it is, I definitely think it's the correct one, is not to mandate the use of it, even though the IG report said that, because culture change is very different, and it's difficult. Once that word mandate comes in, people will find ways to go around your mandate. So what we said is that the CIO, Larry Sweet, said that we're going to strongly encourage you to consider West Prime first. Now, if you can come up with a reason why this is not going to work for you, then that's a different story. But we really want you to consider this first. We've also come up with really good cost savings in how we actually interconnect with the cloud service providers. So, for example, every single program or application doesn't need to have their own direct connect, which is, it can get very expensive, and it's a nightmare to manage across NASA. So that we give them incentives to do this. We've also come up with a very good phased approach in how to show value. Because what we're finding is there's 3 different kinds of customers or stakeholders we have. One is somebody who needs to put a legacy application into the cloud. The other one is somebody who has kind of built an application that is virtualized and probably will work very well in the cloud. And the third is somebody who wants to develop a new application in the cloud. And we want to cater to all 3 of those types of stakeholders. So what we did is we came up with a phased approach. The folks that have those legacy applications, and I actually have an application that has some Fortran code in it, and so this really has worked well. How do you get that application? Well, first of all, you can take that application and make sure it has the most up-to-date technical components within it. So, for example, in the data center environment, you may not have changed out that version of Cold Fusion that might be 5 versions old. But moving it into the cloud, what we've been able to do is standardize on the most up-to-date recent version of these types of technical components. And Cold Fusion at NASA is a big thing, so I had to bring that one up. So that's phase 1, and that has brought a lot of good security practices into place. It's helped with better management of patch management. It has done a lot of different technical automation updates that we couldn't have done if we had 5 different versions of that particular thing. The second phase is really focused more on the fact that now that I have this in the cloud, how do I make it more optimized? And what we're finding is that a lot of things that are in the data center, especially if they were put on a hardware server type of thing, they were over-architected for whatever reason. So once we move them into the cloud, what we find is the utilization is very low. So they're using 1% of CPU utilization. So now, if there's a server that we said, you need an extra large to run this application, they may actually just need a medium, which instantaneously gives you a pretty good savings in your hosting costs. So now we're at the third phase, which is really looking at the actual application and how do we optimize that application. And that phase is ongoing. And so that one is a tough one, but at least every step of the way we've been able to show the fact that there is cost savings, optimization, without the lose of functionality or autonomy for the stakeholder.
Now, kind of shifting gears slightly, NASA has made a big push to go open source in a lot of ways and move away from those proprietary systems. Could you just maybe talk a little bit about the impulse behind that?
Sure.
And where you're using open source now and where you could be in the future?
That was a key driver to this entire proposal and this whole acquisition that we did. Part of the lessons learned that we've had, or that I've had from the past, is technology changes too fast, It's really about the fact that we need to make sure that we're focused more on how we provide the right functionality or service to the audience, whoever that audience is. What I didn't want to do is I didn't want to have anything that was that would kind of hold us hostage in a sense within us technology. So even before we did the acquisition, what we did was we made the entire West Prime or web services environment into the NASA's flagship OpenGov initiative. So basically, not meaning that every single piece of everything we do is open source, but as much as possible, you had to consider open source first. Then you had to consider open standard, even if it was proprietary, because it had to have open APIs. And then thirdly, we would consider proprietary software. So it gave a gamut, but it really forced everybody to say, okay, I need to do the justifications before I go away from open source. And it's been great because now what we're finding is interoperability and integration make it a lot easier because now we can focus on APIs, we can focus on standards-based development rather than, oh, this is what I sell, this is what my expertise is, so I'm going to use this product set.
I just want to remind everybody listening in and tuning in, don't forget to tweet your questions using the hashtag TechExecViewcast. And with that, we have a few questions from our Twitter audience that I wanted to turn to. And the first is really a leadership kind of culture question that I think kind of will resonate with a lot of people. The question says, our budget is cut, we've lost people, and morale seems low. How do we instill creativity and passion again in our office?
I think you have to first of all say, okay, anything's possible. When sequestration occurred for that whole period, I lost about 40% of my budget right in the middle of migration. I could have started saying, okay, this is dead in the water. Let's descope, do all of that. But what we decided to do is start saying we can do it. I think building the right teams, and what I mean by that is every single person, that person who's been the most disenfranchised by morale issues or by budget cuts, that's the person, you need your naysayers to be part of that passion. You have to build the right team. You have to have people who don't think like you do, and you have to allow them to really get in your face and say, hey, wait a second, this is not going to work. Not naysayers, but people who will try to give you a different opinion on how to do something. Some of the best opinions or some of the best strategies that we came up with really were from people who weren't very fond of working with the CIO's office. What we did is, I think I said this in the past, we went to 200 and some stakeholders. I think it was closer to 250. A lot of those folks blatantly told me, we don't want to work with the CIO's office. We just don't think that you can deliver anything. So I said, okay, so give us something that you want to be part of. And what if I make a commitment that I will make this my priority to deliver? It was some very simple things. So it was really taking those tiny little wins and making sure that you build trust. It doesn't happen overnight. It took me almost 14 weeks with a team of about 3 or 4 people to really go around and talk to these folks. 14 weeks, meaning I would do one-on-ones or, one-on-ones or 1 hour meetings with groups, maybe 4 or 5 hours a day for all those weeks. And what it showed me was trust is a very tough thing to gain, but once you gain it, even if it's the smallest bit, people will find the great ideas, and as long as you make sure that you give them credit for these great ideas. I tell people I'm their cheerleader. I don't have great ideas. I just try to put them together and make sure that we can enterprise them. How successful have we been? Well, I think it's an iterative process. I think that we have a good product right now and good services. It can get a lot better, but that takes time. And we can't go to perfection. And I think that's what a lot of times folks want. And, folks who are leaders and folks who want leadership, they want perfection. There is no such thing as perfection in IT. So you just have to move one step forward.
And when you talk about, building those quick wins in, something that, a problem that seems to plague a lot of big government IT projects is this idea. Some of them are too big to succeed in a certain sense. There are these humongous, very ambitious programs, and they get constantly delayed and they go over budget in terms of, rather than, maybe focusing on one small piece and being able to deliver that not only increases capability, but it also kind of for the psychic well-being of people working on the project to show that they have something to show for it.
Sure. So strategically, you have to have that big picture. You have to know exactly what does that end state look like. You have to be able to articulate that. But the steps that you have to take to get to that point can be tiny. An example is just to get people to understand what adaptive or responsive design was a big thing, because that has a very different way of how you're going to develop, or using restful technologies. Getting these types of words out. So now when I see a new project being created or even funded, I start saying, are you using this? And then we can start that conversation. Now, in the big picture, am I catching every single one of them? No, but that's that perfection versus, the right step forward. And then what I've found is when people see value, others will look at what they're doing and they will also do the same thing. So it's kind of a cascading effect. If you can't show one person value, you can't really mandate everybody doing it some way. And that value piece is the only way you're going to gain trust.
Shifting gears a little bit to another question from one of our followers on Twitter. What are your thoughts on FedRAMP, and is it sufficient?
I think FedRAMP is probably one of the best programs that GSA has created, or from the government perspective. A lot of times and I've worked in multiple government agencies, and I'm sure I was just as much to blame for having this kind of thought process. We are very special. The interesting thing is, I don't need to go and do the same assessment that 12 other people need to do to use the same service. So from a FedRAMP perspective, I think that having this integrated way of saying, okay, Service X, Cloud Service X, you are FedRAMP vetted. That gives me a good foundation where I can build upon. Now I can look at it more from my agency-specific requirements and risk posture and thresholds, but I don't have to redo all the things that I'm going to find the same exact conclusions from. So I think it's a great project. I wish it was a bigger program so that more and more of the cloud service providers, including some of the software as a service providers, can really become can become vetted and certified, so that I don't have to I can have a bigger pool of cloud service providers that I can really look at carefully.
And West Prime fully integrates with FedRAMP in that whole process.
Yeah. We took advantage of what FedRAMP did. We actually took advantage of them and the work that Health and Human Services had done with Amazon Web Services. So FedRAMP was just a little behind to certify. So when we needed it last year, so we actually went through an agency certification, which was using all the controls of FedRAMP. So now we're consistent. We have, we work hand in hand to make sure that we look at what the FedRAMP, changes are and so on. And what we assess ourselves to is not only the FedRAMP controls, but also all the FISMA controls for our platform and our applications.
Returning to another Twitter question, the questioner asks, is a vehicle like West Prime something other agencies could attempt, and how do you start?
Well, you can't use West Prime itself because it's we've got more folks using that want to use it than the ceiling is going to allow us. However, I will be happy to share with anybody the requirements. I mean, we did a Schedule 70 buy. From an integrator perspective, I think it was very important to do it the way we did by using a cloud service broker. Now, the other thing that I would look at very carefully is really looking at how do you actually procure the cloud services itself. As the broker, InfoZen, who's the contractor who does it, they've been very good about making sure it's a pass-through. However, because of the type of contract it is, it's very difficult to get some of the real-time savings from the utility model for Amazon. But so you may want to look at kind of a hybrid model where you have, the time and material for, or just the material for the actual cloud services, and then the integration pieces. The requirements won't change, though. There's some requirements in there that have been trued and tried, vetted through all of the development work that Nebula did. Also, we reviewed them against all the guidance that's been given by the acquisition folks, the Chief Acquisition Council, and it's the Chief Information Council, Information Officer Council. So, our IG did a full review of all those requirements, and they feel that they met all the FedRAMP and all the FSMA requirements.
And, kind of in talking about application for other agencies, this approach, about a month ago, there was an Inspector General report from the Environmental Protection Agency that found there was a lack of kind of visibility into how many cloud contracts they had, or how many cloud services they were actually using. And so would something like West Prime, with kind of an enterprise-wide approach, help? If agencies were using one kind of clearinghouse,
yep,
it would kind of help. And then also, this would have been just a few months ago, GSA announced that they're going to do a cloud special item number, which
yep,
will help more agencies purchase, but also be able to look at trends and see who's doing what.
I think those are all great ideas, and I'll tell you, one of the biggest issues is you can't have a strategy that's a one-size-fits-all. So you have to be able to say, okay, am I providing different modes of getting to the cloud? Because it's not all going to be the same type of requirements that you have. Your base requirements, and that's why FedRAMP and things like that are so important, because you can have your base as FedRAMP, but if I'm building an application where I'm just doing data analytics on big data, it's going to have a very different security posture. And what if it's open data, of all things? Different security posture than my NASA engineering network with 4 million documents in it that may have sensitive information. So you don't want to have a one-size-fits-all, but the acquisition should be based on a framework of how you want cloud to be used across your agency, rather than one contract vehicle or one set of requirements.
Just to remind everybody, keep sending your questions in using the hashtag TechExecViewcast, and we'll get to a few more from our followers. How much is NASA in the cloud now? I know in terms of spending, the total IT budget is something like $1.5 billion, and of that, only about 1% is spent on cloud. So we're still, at the tip of the iceberg. What do you envision, the future looking like? Obviously, 1%. There's pretty much only one way to go from 1%. So, but maybe where do you see, for the future?
Absolutely, we're going to go more and more into the cloud. NASA's a unique agency in the sense that we have a lot of data. We have a lot of data that is considered open data, and more is becoming more open and more available to the public. So I see that being that part, the whole data exposure part, growing exponentially in the next few years. What we also do, and this is why I can't give you a dollar amount, because we do things that are a little different. We do things called Space Act agreements. So we may have an agreement, a partnering agreement with a company to do some of these things where it really benefits the public, like exposure of data. So I couldn't tell you, what if we exposed all data that is exposable and it didn't cost us anything? Is that a savings? I don't know. Is that a cost? I don't know. The other thing is that we have to really not just focus on the dollars spent in the cloud. We need to focus on what is really acceptable in the cloud. Because at the end of the day, like I said, the migration costs can be very expensive. So there may be things that might not be a bad idea to just keep in place until it's ready to be migrated, or it's at that part of the life cycle so that it is migrated, that it is a good opportunity. So I would say it's going to go up. It's going to go up slowly because, it's a culture change. There's a lot of, the real big bang for our buck is some of the back office stuff. And you have to feel very comfortable about putting your HR system in the cloud. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think a lot of people are there yet.
And the big, probably the biggest stumbling block in terms of a culture change, as you mentioned, is when these components and bureaus they can't touch the information
Right.
or the infrastructure that they used to be able to. So,
Right.
I mean, how do you get past that?
I think you have to be able to show folks that not having access to the actual physical piece or not being able to know where the controls are does not give them a different set of security. I'll give you an example, and a lot of times it's really about showing them use cases. So a use case that I will use, because this is a great one that you can laugh at me about, one of the applications I was in charge of before we migrated, I won't name which one, was a public application which had been hacked. Nobody knew about it. And thank God this was not a sensitive application. This was a public facing and it was so blatantly hacked that it had the rootkit in there. It had the hackers actually say, hey, we hacked your this particular application 3 or 4 times, and you guys still haven't done anything about it. Being able to show those types of examples and say, making fun of my own self, saying, this is something that I should have found right when I started this project or this job. And being able to say, now look at this. Now I can show you how this application that was probably had been hacked for the last 3 years will never be hacked because of these controls that we've put in place and these processes that we've put in place. And when I start showing people how we do this, then they say, okay, you might have that same vested interest in my security as I did. Maybe I don't need to touch that anymore. So it's really about those use cases, building that trust, and doing it in a phased, small wins, phased approach.
And with the idea of kind of a saturation of cloud in terms of public-facing websites, do you think it's at all practical that at one point in time or at some point in the future, all of NASA's external-facing websites could be migrated to the cloud?
That would be a great. That's the outcome. That's the goal. That would be great to have. In my book, there's 2 reasons for that. One is security. We should never have externally exposed IPs within our own data centers. But the second reason is there's so many opportunities for efficiencies, especially when it comes to infrastructure. Think about every server you have that runs a website or a web app. If we can actually consolidate some of that infrastructure without ever even thinking about consolidating the websites, even though that would be a good outcome also, then we've already saved a lot of money. Because at the end of the day, think about all of that life cycle cost of your hardware, of the servers, whether they're virtual or not. They're going to be replenished and refreshed on a regular basis. That's a lot of cost. Here, I'm paying for a service. So now I can start really looking at how do I create a database that has all my data that can be delivered to all these applications or these websites. I can look at very different architectures where the outcome, which is having planetary science or science.nasa.gov have their own ability to show the information that's appropriate for their audience be different than the website for Space Station Live be able to show the type of information that's appropriate for them. How do I do that? I can do that by having much more consolidation and integration of that data rather than of the application. So it's more of separating out that data from the application and then being able to use that data in the best way possible.
And you know, with the news this week that the first phase of the web migration has been completed, what do you think? You know, is there a point where you know kind of say we're done, or is this like a continuing spectrum? You know, where are we at this point?
I don't think you're ever done in IT, but in this case, I don't think we'll ever be done. I mean, if you think about where our outcome is, 1,500 websites, 2,000 plus applications, and if I'm just looking at 110 that we've done so far, we've got a long way to go. And this is, you know, it's taken us a good year and a half to get to this point. We've learned a lot of lessons. We've been able to automate a lot of things. We've been able to provide services that make it much more effective for people to want to move into the cloud. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in the next 6 months. So what I try to do is I try to have goals that are not just about consolidation of websites or how many I put into the cloud. I try to have real goals that really show what are the benefits. So is the benefit that I just consolidated the infrastructure of 5 different applications so only one instance is needed now in the cloud? Or have I taken out 3 other technologies that, you know, were so similar, or different versions of 3 different technologies, so that now we have a lot less operations and management budget that we need to have for these applications.
So it looks like we're out of time for today. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciated having you. And please stay tuned for the next interview with Constance Sayers Witherspoon and Intel.
Thanks to Jack and Roopangi for that interesting discussion, and thanks to you, our viewers, for tuning in today. I'm Constance Sayers Witherspoon. I'm the president of Government Executive Media Group, and I'm here with Steve Oren, chief technologist for Intel Corp's Intel Federal. We're going to continue this conversation about how the government is embracing innovation. But first, a few words about Steve. Steve is responsible for cybersecurity, cloud strategy, architecture, and engagements. He has held architectural leadership positions at Intel, where he has led strategy and projects on identity, cloud, virtualization security, anti-malware, and HTML5 security. Steve is a recognized expert and frequent lecturer on enterprise security and was named one of InfoWorld's top 25 CTOs of 2004, and in 2009 was named a fellow at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. I want to thank Amazon Web Services and Intel for supporting today's Viewcast. And thanks to Steve for being with me today.
You're welcome.
So let's get right to it. Where do you find that agencies are having the most difficulties in IT innovation? Is it tighter budgets, outdated policies, workforce issues, or just a combination of all these things?
Well, I think mostly it's about the tighter budgets. People are trying to do more with less, and agencies are looking to try to get the cost savings while still meeting mission objectives. Now, that said, technology is evolving faster than most agency staff can keep abreast of, and so there's a constant catch-up that they have to do in order to understand the new architectures and new technologies that are coming down the pike.
How can Intel help?
So I think Intel can help in a couple of ways, both by educating and helping agencies understand these new technology evolutions and the emerging trends that are going on, helping them take advantage of these technologies and new architectures in the most cost-effective and efficient ways, while at the same time driving the overall ecosystem to deliver those technologies to the agencies in ways that they can integrate into their existing networks and take advantage of the next generation and the next trend that's coming along.
How is software-defined infrastructure, or SDI, changing the way data structure infrastructure is managed and delivered?
So software-defined infrastructure is really changing the way that the data center and the infrastructure are being provided in much the same way that cloud service providers have been doing internally for a long time. It's changing the way you look at your overall infrastructure, the compute, the network, storage, components of your data center. At the same time, it also changes the way you do quality of service, administration, and ultimately security. Concepts like SDI, or software-defined infrastructure, software-defined networking, or SDN, network function virtualization, and the like, are really changing the way that not only the infrastructure is deployed and managed, but ultimately how you deliver services, how you deliver applications to your users and to the agency's mission objectives. These changes not only provide better efficiencies and elasticity to the delivery of those service models, but also change the way that these are consumed by the ultimate user.
How are government agencies and departments looking to evolve their data center designs to really take advantage of the innovations that are being led by cloud service providers?
So I think part of it is understanding that by making not just the applications and the services themselves, but the underlying infrastructure elastic and more fluid, it allows them to start to deliver services in a composable way. And so you start to look at the applications and the data and how they get delivered to the mission in a way that not only looks at the overall transaction workflow, but also looks like how do you encapsulate the network, how do you encapsulate storage, and how do you encapsulate compute in a way that delivers that more elastic, on-demand kind of service. As with any new technology revolution or evolution, there is going to be some upfront costs as you start to re-architect for them. But one of the nice things about software-defined is that you really start to see that cost savings when you move from more the siloed, brittle, and old-fashioned way of approaching networks and compute and storage and make them more efficient, make them more interoperable and composable. Now, this does, of course, present some challenges to how you manage those and how you secure those environments.
My last question is actually a two-part question. The first is, what implications do software-defined networking and network function virtualization do they have on security and compliance?
Well, when we start to take a look at these technologies and these architectural evolutions, starting with network function virtualization, which is really about virtualizing the network infrastructure and then providing a layer of orchestration for how those network functions and network components are delivered. And then as that evolves into SDN, which is the next step of abstraction, to separate the data plane from the control plane layers, we really have to reevaluate the existing network security controls and the existing security models that we've applied to these network architectures. It means we have to look at how did we apply the existing controls to make sure, in essence, that SDN and NFV do no more harm than what we had today, but also how do we start to take advantage of these new architectures and apply or enhance our security controls to take advantage of this more ephemeral, on-demand, and dynamic kind of environment.
How do you look to leverage innovations like SDN, to enhance the network and the government security and compliance?
Well, I think we have a really interesting opportunity here. So for the first time, we're starting to separate these different functions into software-definable or composable concepts, which means we can start to take a look back at some of the nagging security challenges that we've had for many years in the more siloed, brittle parts of our network architecture. We can start to look at using these on-demand or elastic fluid network components and security components that are taking advantage of this new network architecture to address things like more automated response to threats, end-to-end trust that not only encapsulates the data and the application and the workflow, but also the underlying network, the underlying compute, and the underlying storage, ultimately getting us not only to an on-demand service delivery, but at the end of the day, being able to do on-demand elastic network service delivery both to the applications and data and ultimately to our users.
Steve, thank you so much for your insights and thank you for being here today. And I do want to thank our viewers for tuning in today. If you would like to view this event again or share the archive with your colleagues, it will be available on our website for 3 months. We'll see you next time. Thank you.